Everything comes to he who waits. So, this was another one this was a patron-sponsored review, and it's something a little bit different, and it might, no promises yet, but it might become a new occasional series, almost kind of an antidote to something like Good Movie, Bad Ending. Calling it Silver Linings, and this is me talking about a movie that I know is not good, but I still really like, and pointing out the things that are kind of great about it. And this gives me the opportunity to talk about a piece of my childhood, the Masters of the Universe movie from the 80s, starring Dolph Lundgren as He-Man. Oh boy, okay. So maybe a little bit of background for my sort of history with this property. I was very into He-Man when I was young. I was into the toys more than anything else. I did watch the show. It was one of several shows that my grandmother used to tape for me because she had cable. My mother didn't even have the rabbit ear set up on the TV. We just had VHSs. So my grandmother would tape off the TV all of my favorite shows and send those to me. So I kind of saw the same episodes over and over and over again, and I liked He-Man. I always did, but I always got way more mileage out of the toys, and I think ultimately I look back on the little mini comics with more nostalgia than the actual episodes of the TV show. It doesn't hurt that I think the mini comics hold up better than the episodes of the TV show do, but so in that way, right off the bat, I actually did enjoy this film. First time I saw it, I didn't see it in the theaters, but I remember I was renting it regularly, and my mother eventually just bought me a copy. This was back when buying VHSs was like $30 in 80s money. So not an inexpensive proposition, but I kept renting it over and over again. So she bought me a copy, and I know, and I know in hindsight, because I didn't really know at the time, internet wasn't a thing yet, but I know a lot of fans didn't like it because of how much it differed from the TV show, and it does, but it bears a closer resemblance overall to the mini comics, which ultimately I kind of like better. And by that I mean there's no Prince Adam, there's no secret identity, there's a whole bunch of stuff that was unique to the show that just isn't there. Instead, He-Man is just He-Man. Wandering warrior, defender of Eternia, He-Man. And so that's what we get. Now, since this is going to be mostly a positive thing, and me talking about the things I love about this film, allow me to acknowledge the problems with it and acknowledge them up front. This was made by Cannon Films, and Cannon Films in the 80s, it was a Golden Globus production. Their whole thing was trying to make A movie blockbusters on B movie budgets. And you could tell how much they didn't spend on most of their projects. I do find this one to be kind of unique in the Golden Globus Cannon Films scheme of things, though. And by that I mean most Cannon Films, or at least the ones that I've seen, I haven't seen a ton, they tended to just stretch their budgets very thin. They took whatever money they had, stretched it out over the length of the film, and the whole film just kind of looks not very expensive. What they did in He-Man instead was to spend the money very selectively. And there's a whole bunch of things that they did that was very obviously done as cost-cutting techniques. So, like, for instance, instead of a small army of unique, monsters and henchmen, characters like Merman and Trapjaw and all these unique-looking henchmen for Skeletor to have, instead he has a handful of specific henchmen, and then the rest is just a sea of generic Stormtrooper knockoffs, except they're in black instead of white. That was a cost-cutting measure because that was cheaper to do than to give every henchman a unique look. About half of the film is set on Earth in easily acquired, cheap to shoot in locations like warehouses and gymnasiums and you know, cheap looking apartments and things of that nature. And then the few scenes we see in Eternia, there's really effectively only 3 locations that we see in Eternia at all. So you can see very clearly where the cost cutting was done. However, what they spent the money on, they went all in on. So it wasn't a matter of it all looks cheap. What they spent money on, I'd say they spent it pretty well. The practical effects we do get on the various creatures like Beastman, like the original characters of people like Karg and Sarad, and of course the makeup on Skeletor himself, I actually really love. I'm still astounded by that makeup. What I love about the makeup on Skeletor is that while it is not necessarily going to pass for just being a skull, it's a little, you know, it's too bulky, he's got a little too much movement. It is incredibly evocative of a skull, but more to the point, it looks hard. It looks like if you hit it, it would, you know, it would clunk, it would knock. But he has enough movement in the face to give a pretty full performance, and it doesn't seem to impede the performance that Frank Langella as Skeletor is able to give, and I still don't really know how they did that. And the interior, the sort of throne room space of the interior of Castle Grayskull, that's a phenomenal set. That's a huge set. Took up 2 sound stages. It's epic. But some of the other problems with it, before I get into the stuff that I love and will always love. So, Dolph Lundgren as He-Man kind of works and kind of doesn't. He looks the part pretty well. At this point, I don't think he was quite ready for prime time in terms of being a lead, because he's a little bit of a charisma vacuum, and he can't seem to settle on what his accent is. He's not awful, and again, he looks the part well enough, but he doesn't, he's not particularly magnetic. It does help that he has decent chemistry with, say, Teela and Man-at-Arms, which are not amazingly performed, but the 3 of them have good chemistry together, so that helps. The action is not particularly well filmed. It's decently choreographed, but it's shot competently, unimpressively. It's not shot in a way to for the fight choreography that they have, a better cinematography on the fight scenes could have really given it something. We have these tag-on characters. I mentioned some of the villains that are unique to this movie, which I could just kind of shrug off. Like, it's fine, because they're consistent with the kinds of villains that Skeletor had in the TV show and in the comics. But we lose Orko and we get Gwildor instead. I think that's a fair compromise. There was no way they could have afforded to realize Orko accurately. And Gwildor's Billy Barty, and I liked Billy Barty a lot. But we also get these, because a big chunk of it is set on Earth, we get the human teenage characters of Kevin and Julie. With Julie being played by a young Courtney Cox, and the name of the guy who plays Kevin is escaping me at the moment, but he was Paris on Star Trek Voyager. Now, I would actually argue that they kind of lucked out with those two, that neither of them give phenomenal performances, but they do give off that these people, they are going to have careers after that. They're going to be okay. They give off that vibe. They give off this is an early step in somebody who's going to have a decent enough career. And that helps a little. But again, you know, who watches a Master of the Universe movie for a couple of teenagers from Earth? Nobody. That's who. So even though they're fine for what they are is not what anyone's there to see. James Tolkien is in it, who most people know as the tough principal from the Back to the Future movies. He was kind of an 80s staple, and he is always awesome. He just plays a cop, and he's great. But and the one other thing that I want to acknowledge, just because I do think it is worth acknowledging these things, because I know it is a deal breaker for some people. The director of this film, Gary Goddard, who's had an odd career, because this was really his only theatrically released film. Most of what he made his career on since then has been theme park rides that incorporate some degree of video elements, you know, things like the Back to the Future ride and things like that. He might have been involved in the Terminator ride as well. I don't know. I don't have a list off the top of my head of which ones he did. But the reason I want to bring it up is the fact that he is one of a number of people in the last few years who has been accused by more than one individual of molesting, in this case, young men, boys, some time ago. I think possibly past the statute of limitations. I didn't look up the specifics because honestly they kind of skeeve me. But last I remember checking, he was being sued. He was being taken to civil court because the statute of limitations for criminal charges had passed. So if you're someone who cannot stomach watching the films of Roman Polanski or, you know, anything with Bill Cosby or, you know, things like that, be aware that that is regrettably an element in this. And my part, you know, I kind of square that circle by I had the VHS and I've bought the DVD a long time before I knew that. I already paid what I'm going to pay and contributed, you know, money to this man. And if I'd known before I paid that money, maybe I wouldn't have. But at this point, I already own it, and it is nostalgia. It is a big part of my childhood. So I have rewatched it since that stuff came out, and it has. I think it helps that he's the director, and he's not a face I have to look at. So it helps me be able to still enjoy this. But I did just want to acknowledge that reality of it. So that's, you know, touching on a couple of the good stuff, but that's mainly me talking about what's not especially good about this movie. So what's the silver lining? Well, I mentioned it earlier, but let's get into it. Frank Langella as Skeletor. Oh my God. So Frank Langella had, I think he said this was one of his favorite parts he ever got to play, with how over the top he got to be. And I would say this is right up there with Tim Curry playing Darkness in Legend, for an actor who is able to go, who is buried, you know, in this elaborate makeup, but is able to go so big that he doesn't disappear behind the makeup, that we don't lose the performance, that he doesn't feel like he's struggling to be seen from behind it. He dominates the screen whenever he's on it. He reads these lines like it's Shakespeare. Heck, they actually give him a line lifted out of Shakespeare, lifted out of Richard III, for crying out loud. And I love that. And I don't know if this is the case, but part of me really does wonder, like, was that always in the script? Or did they add that when they realized how Frank Langella was going to play this? And it's so good. And in my mind, like, that is the Skeletor voice. Like, if I reread those old mini comics, which I've still got some of, that's who I hear. I don't hear the, you know, the high-pitched, "I'll get you, He-Man." I don't hear that anymore. That guy's a loser. This Skeletor is not a loser. He's intimidating. And actually, as the film starts, he's already won. And it makes him, because that was one of the things about the TV show. He was always trying to upset the status quo, but he was always on the back foot. He was the troublemaker who didn't make very much trouble at the end of the day. Here, he's won. He has the power, and it's He-Man and his friends who are completely on the back foot. And it is earned. Everything about him, his voice, the way he carries himself, his interactions. I love him with Evelyn. Meg Foster. Okay. This woman, the way that they visualized Evelyn is really cool. First of all, it just looks neat. But I was knocked on my butt when I found out that her eyes are not contacts. How was this woman not cast as a witch or a sorceress prior to this film? I will never know, because you look at those eyes and it is the epitome of hypnotic. And she has a very interesting and intriguing presence in addition to that, especially when she has scenes opposite Frank Langella. And Skeletor is well utilized across this movie. He-Man is only in the same room with him at the very beginning and at the very end, but we still get sprinklings of him throughout. So he is the best thing about the movie, and we get doses of him as we go, which means that the best thing about the movie is not something that you have withheld from you for the majority of the runtime. You see it on the screen, and you continue to follow it through the rest of the film and through its weaknesses. Because as I said, that there is from any objective measure a lot about this movie that isn't good. I would argue for the limitations that it had on it in terms of the budget and who was making it, and the fact that Golden Globus actually tried to shut it down before it was even finished filming. They weren't even going to have a final fight, which is why that last fight takes place in this weird pitch black, almost sort of nether realm. It's because they actually couldn't get back onto the set. They had to rig up like a storage warehouse, like somebody's garage practically, to fake it so that they could get that last fight in. So under the circumstances, I think it's an impressive piece of work, knowing the limitations of it. And if you have not seen Frank Langella as Skeletor, for that alone, that is the overriding silver lining of this thing. And it's the reason I kept coming back to it. It's the reason I still love it now. And everything else I still have affection for, but that is the one thing I would point to and go, no matter what, you don't have to like this movie, but I will not hear a bad word against Frank Langella's Skeletor. He is the silver lining of this film, and it's why I love it so much. There are other things I like too, but at the end of the day, that is it. He's the best thing about a admittedly not great movie that I still love. So, Masters of the Universe from the 80s. Have you seen it? What did you think about it? Again, I will not hear a bad word against Frank Langella. No, seriously, whatever you thought, it's fine. So drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. There's all this stuff to do. You know what it is. You don't need me to tell you. It's all down in the description. Patreon's the big one. I will mention that. But, you know, until next time, Council is adjourned.